So, good morning, afternoon, or evening, as the case may be. I'm Mike Wheeler, and I'm very pleased to be the host of Democratic Dialogue for this month's sessions. And I'm particularly pleased to have as a guest an old and dear friend of mine, J.B. Kittredge, like me, a Gloucester resident and so forth. We're going to talk about civil liberties, in particular, issues of great concern to you, J.B. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your interests?
Sure. Well, do you want me to start with my ACLU affiliation?
Absolutely.
Sure. So the ACLU of Massachusetts is our local arm of the ACLU. I'm the president of the board, and I should say at the beginning that there are other people who tell you what the official position of the ACLU is, so I'll probably get a couple things wrong. I'm expressing my views. And generally speaking, if you're an ACLU member, you agree with about 80% of what we do, and if you're a board member, it's about 60%. So I'll go for my 60%.
Okay, well, let me hit on this. So in other words, you've got a board where there must be lively conversations
Absolutely.
About policy in that
Sure.
regard, because these are challenging issues.
Sure.
I'd have to look at my card, but I've been a member for at least 40 years, and I may be pushing 50. We could spend a good long time, and I mean good time too, as well as long, going through these issues. We have a limited amount of time.
Sure.
What is it that you care about most, and you feel that people need to know about where the ACLU works in different ways
Sure.
in protecting our rights?
Yeah. Well, the ACLU, one of our taglines is that we're Liberty's lawyer, and Liberty resides under our system in the federal constitution and in the state constitutions. When you have a local chapter like the Massachusetts ACLU, we focus on both those things. We look at both our state constitution and the federal constitution. I came to the ACLU in part through the gay rights aspect of what the ACLU was working on, which involved, among other things, bringing the successful case in the U.S. Supreme Court recognizing the right of gay people to get married, and in that case to be treated the same way under the tax system, so that gay people weren't taxed at a higher rate than non-gay people.
The story here, you remember Jesse Ventura,
yes.
former governor of
yes.
Minnesota,
yes.
libertarian, right?
Yep.
And it's interesting how there are some libertarians who come very close to my positions because they're concerned about lots of things. And he was on a radio show. He was visiting at the Kennedy School after his term in Minnesota as governor was over. Navy SEAL, I can't do his deep voice.
With a bandana, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
Yep.
And the conservative host asked him, how do you feel about this new decision by the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts allowing men to marry men and women to marry women? Yep. And he told a story about how he'd been a professional wrestler, and one of his dear friends was gay and had a long-term relationship. And when his friend fell ill, his partner at the time didn't have access to see him.
Yep.
And that he felt, he said, I've been married very happily for 30 years. It's a very important part of my life. Everybody should have that right. So he was a true libertarian.
Sure.
And I must admit, I'd had a preconception of where he might be coming from, and it was such a delight to hear him say that.
Yeah, well, and it's not a trivial thing. My spouse was very ill last year, and when I showed up at the hospital and they say, what's your relationship to the patient, there's one answer, spouse, and the doors are opened. And previously, here's my power of attorney, I've signed, sealed, delivered. It's a very powerful thing. And the case that the Supreme Court heard was actually about a woman who was widowed. Her deceased spouse, because they'd been married in New York, under New York law, had an estate. And usually when a husband dies and leaves everything to his wife, there's no tax. But in this case, the federal government wanted to take half of the assets. And the ACLU said, well, that's not really fair. I mean, she took care of someone who had MS for 20 years, and the government's answer is to take half of the assets? That's not right.
Well, we're talking about civil liberties. We're talking about liberties of individuals weighed against the powers of the state.
Correct.
And the state does have some rights and responsibilities. It can put up stop signs, It even, in terms of speech, as I understand it at least, you can't get a megaphone and stand in front of my house and make a lot of noise in the middle of the night, there's a time, place, and manner, a reasonable restriction that can be imposed on it. So you can have noise requirements. But content, no. You can't touch that. And the ACLU has been very good about that. I remember decades ago, I mean, this almost makes my stomach turn, but the Nazis marching in Skokie.
Correct.
And nobody wants to support the Nazis, but we want to support speech. And if they can't talk, then who else can't talk?
That's
and you
right.
get going down a slippery slope.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right, Mike. And, one of the things that it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about, the Constitution, which I have here. Anybody can get their ACLU copy. What's interesting about it is that when the Constitution was first ratified back in the 18th century, it was really focused on what the federal government shouldn't be allowed to do. That's what those bills of rights are. Congress shall not do this. Congress shall not do this. Congress can't do such and such, right? We allowed, though, in the 18th century, the states to do pretty much whatever they wanted. The Constitution didn't tell the states what they could or couldn't do. And in some states, the policy of the state was to have half of its residents slaves. And they didn't even count as people until they wanted to figure out how many congressmen they got. Then they decided that a slave was worth 3/5 of a person. We had a civil war. And after the Civil War, we have the 14th Amendment, which isn't in the original Bill of Rights, but it starts to say the states can't do certain things. And this is where a lot of the litigation of the ACLU and other people who are interested in civil liberties takes place, is trying to make sure that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or the state of New York doesn't do things that we think deprive people of life, liberty, and property. Some pretty abstract concepts that we've left to the courts to figure out. But the whole question of, for example, the Supreme Court says you have the right to burn a flag. It's not something I'm interested in doing, but it's important that people have that right.
Well, on that particular issue, because that is very offensive to many people, and
to me, it's offensive.
It's also counterproductive.
Yes.
If you're trying to gain support and so forth, come on, grow up. Don't do that. But there's nothing about flag burning in the Constitution.
Correct.
There is in the First Amendment a guarantee of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Now that's been broadened to expression because you think about art, for example, there are lots of different ways in which ideas and passions are expressed. So I think that's a fair construal of the intent, but the founders in 1789, and in the 1860s, the people who drafted and supported the 14th Amendment had no way of imagining the kind of expression that we have now online and through those media. We're not living in those days, and we ought to be careful about how narrowly we read prescriptions that apply to a social situation which is radically different from what we see today.
I agree. I think that this is an ongoing debate, and one of the reasons I mentioned the history is I do think that the interpretation questions that come up have been somewhat hijacked by the more conservative members of the Supreme Court, because they keep looking at 1787. They ignore a civil war. They ignore the fact that we decided that as residents of our states, we could turn to the federal government to protect us as well, our federal Constitution, to protect us from the overreach of the states. And, it's interesting that perhaps there are people who say, well, it talks about free speech. Why do we say that a flag burning is expression and expression is like speech? Isn't that a slippery slope? Where are we going with this? I'd point out that the federal Constitution starts with the words, Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say it shall make some laws, the ones that we like. It says Congress shall make no law abridging speech. So you mentioned that, the local government can tell me that I can't have a bullhorn. We've already allowed a reasonable way of thinking about these words, right? They have to be read in context.
Well, there's also the, common story that you can't yell fire in a theater. And if you go back prior to the Constitution, there were laws against defamation, slander, and the like. So it was understood broadly that there was some room to say we're going to protect speech, but not in a way that does other people wrong.
Yep.
It may be offensive.
Yep.
That's not wrong.
Yep.
So
I have to add, just for
Please.
local color, that the person who really gave the greatest impetus to the First Amendment was Justice Holmes.
yes.
And there's a very interesting book about how he got where he got while he was vacationing in Gloucester on the North Shore, and his communication with Justice Learned Hand, who he happened to bump into on the train here from Washington. So read it. It's a great book.
Do you
Local
recall,
color.
Do you recall the name of it?
I'm not going to come to it quickly, and I know we've got limited time.
Yeah,
so
okay.
It'll come to me as we're
I
talking.
should do it's a biography, though, of Holmes?
No, it's about how it's called How Justice Holmes Changed His Mind.
Okay.
He started with the idea that if the government could send people off to war and have them killed, it should be able to do just about anything short of that.
Mm-hmm.
He came around to the idea that, no, actually the First Amendment means something. It's an
So
interesting
we've
book.
got some summer reading on
Yeah.
this. So we've talked about gay rights. We've talked some about speech and
Yep.
expression.
Yep.
What other things, as I say, are you passionate about, and what other things does the ACLU, for which you're
involved
not
in.
speaking, you're
Yep.
just speaking for
Yeah, yeah.
yourself, what other frontiers are they working on?
Well, one area that we're working on is the right to vote. You know, it's really the cornerstone of democracy is the right to vote. Interestingly and historically, it's not in the U.S. Constitution. It is, however, in the Massachusetts Constitution that you have a right to vote. And we, for example, brought litigation in the last cycle to try to allow people to register on the day of election. We felt that it had been demonstrated pretty clearly that that could be done without a lot of fuss. And one of our lower courts agreed. The Secretary of State has now agreed that's what we ought to be doing. We didn't get there. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court came to a different conclusion, but I think that that's a really important area.
Some people worry about voter fraud, but as I understand that process, is that those votes of same-day registration are kept separately, and then they can validate that the person actually exists and that they're at that residency and so forth.
Well, the ACLU, after the election, the president appointed a commission to look into so-called voter fraud, of which there really is no evidence.
Right.
The ACLU was all over it and wanted to know what the records were that they were working with. We had all sorts of FOIA requests. These are information requests for documents. And eventually they decided just to disband the thing. It wasn't going to make any sense. And by the way, the ACLU is the outfit that is challenging the Trump administration, which is trying to ask this citizenship question on the census, which is really critical to figuring out not only what the representation will be in Congress, but also how federal monies are applied in different districts. So the ACLU is all over everything. We are, you name it, the ACLU is on it, whether it's...
Okay, but just to be clear,
Sure.
so when you talk about the Trump administration, I think it's fair to say that the ACLU has gone after Democratic officials as well over the years. So
absolutely.
you're
We are nonpartisan but political in the sense that we aren't, sitting in an ivory tower. We know there's a world out there. Whenever we find an ally who believes in the Constitution and people's right to individual liberty, we embrace them. Senator Tarr, our local senator here in Cape Ann, is a Republican. He also believes that all of the artificial intelligence that's being used for facial recognition and things like that should be on a pause. He's endorsed a statute that we have introduced or had introduced. So wherever there's an ally, we find them, and we are equally critical of Republican and Democratic administrations that try to take away people's rights.
Yep, but it's not as if you ever endorse candidates or things of that. So these are around specific issues.
Yeah. We frequently will do a so-called scorecard or a report card where we'll ask you, if you're running for Congress, we'll say, how do you feel about a woman's right to choose? How do you feel about gay rights? How do you feel about X, Y, or Z? And we might then rank the answer.
But those are metrics as opposed to...
Correct. And we might juxtapose those with the opponent, whoever the people are who are running, so that people who care about civil liberties can then make a decision based on that.
Can you take us back a little bit to the artificial intelligence and facial recognition part?
Okay, but I just got rid of my BlackBerry. So you're talking to a dinosaur, but I'll try.
Okay, well, I'm looking at an iPhone
It's new.
there.
It's new.
I see. No, well, maybe I have I know a little bit about that, but there are surveillance cameras everywhere, and there are times that the police have have video of people engaged in wrongdoing, I'll ask a rhetorical question. What's the problem?
Yeah, there usually isn't a problem. What the ACLU's view on so many of these things is you can use all these tools. Just get a warrant. Go to a judge, convince a judge you have probable cause that Mike Wheeler committed a crime or whatever it happens to be, and if you can persuade the judge that there's probable cause, which is a pretty low threshold, then you can go ahead. One of the cases we took, for example, because I have my cell phone here, and because of triangulation, somebody could know that my phone is here and that I'm probably here, right? And in Massachusetts, the police wanted to have access to that information from the phone companies without getting a warrant. And we said, you got to get a warrant. And the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, looking at our state constitution, said, you got to get a warrant. And this is why the state Massachusetts ACLU is so important, I think, because Massachusetts can truly be a beacon of liberty for the rest of the country. And when the same issue came up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, interpreting the U.S. Constitution, they came to the same conclusion. And part of the reason they got there is because we had elucidated, we had articulated some of the concerns about that, and I think it was important to the ultimate decision on the federal level. Same thing with gay marriage. Think about that. That was a Massachusetts only thing for a long time. And the world did not come to an end. That was pretty instructive for people who were worried and nervous, and rightly so, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm going to stay with the facial recognition thing for a moment.
Yeah.
The present concern is that without our permission, many states, maybe Massachusetts as well, have shared our driver's license photos and so forth. And it seems to me, maybe I'm just even more of an old crank as the years tick by, but we have no privacy left, it seems to me, JB. And people might say, oh, you have nothing to hide. What are you worried about? Well, there's a matter of principle there.
Yes, there is.
You know, and we ought to be able to disclose as much or as little about ourselves as we see fit, unless, as you say, there's probable cause that we've been up to mischief or more. In that regard.
Not going to get an argument from me. All I'll say is that, you know, maybe you're better off than I am, and your picture and your license still represents you. I'm getting old, so I'm outgrowing my photo.
No, on the contrary. You know, I remember when you were a little kid, and I wasn't a little kid. I have a birthday coming up, and the horrifying thing is that if you do the math, I have been alive for almost 1/3 of the time that the U.S. Constitution has been in place. Which I'd like to say is the young country. No, it's an old me.
Yeah.
That's the situation.
There were some scarier things, like Strom Thurmond was in the Senate for half the time that the U.S. Republic existed.
Yeah.
I mean, he was around for so long.
But going sideways, I mean, there are many reasons to just leave it there. But I once heard Ted Kennedy's top assistant years back say, you know, the thing about Kennedy is that he could work with anybody. And I said, anybody? And he said, yeah, he once said, you know, Strom Thurmond may be nuts, you know, but still have to deal with him. And Thurmond, incidentally, if we're going to get into the National Enquirer stuff, has a mixed race child.
Yes.
So people are complicated, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
So what else? And as I say, we've got a big constitution, and we've got 9 minutes left here. But what else is on your agenda about things that we really need to know about?
Sure. Well, I think you know it's important to note that technically the ACLU is two organizations. I should probably mention that. And one part of what we do is involved in lobbying and legislative work. And one of the big initiatives that we're working on right now is called the ROE Act. And ROE stands for something, I'm not sure exactly what it is. I think the R is reproductive. But it's about worrying about what happens if Roe versus Wade is overturned or significantly cut back by the U.S. Supreme Court. What's going to happen to women in, among other places, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? And this is both the beauty and the curse of the federal system. The beauty of it is if the federal government will no longer protect women's right to choose and to make health care decisions for herself, then we can make sure that happens in Massachusetts. And so we actually have some legislation pending in front of the General Court, which would basically try to get rid of a lot of really ancient laws from the 19th century and guarantee to women their rights if the federal courts are no longer going to do so. So that's a really important initiative, and it's happening right now.
There's Planned Parenthood. There's also a Center for Reproductive Rights
Correct.
that you've supported.
I'm on the board of it.
So how much cross-pollinization is there among groups of that sort?
That's a great question. And our executive director, Carol Rose, who's wonderful and can be heard in a competing channel on Tuesdays, I think, at WGBH, could answer it better, but I'll let you know that we really work in coalition with a lot of people. Unlike, let's say, the Center for Reproductive Rights, which has one mission. Mm-hmm. The ACLU is the Constitution's lawyer. Voting rights, reproductive rights, gay rights, racial justice. There are a gazillion things that we do, and we find partners in all those different spaces. We are very happy to take the lead and be the point of the spear if no one else seems to be taking something on. We're also happy to fade into the background and provide logistical or other kind of support if other organizations want to take the lead. For example, in Massachusetts, we had a referendum on whether trans people should be able to keep the rights that the state legislature gave them. By the way, once again, the world did not come to an end.
Right.
I have not been assaulted in any bathrooms. And the ACLU nationally gave a big grant. The ACLU locally was very involved. But GLAAD, Gay, Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, was really the one that was the face of the movement. Other organizations. So we work very cooperatively with lots of organizations that are interested in liberty. And sometimes we're in the front, sometimes we're in the back.
So there's the lobbying, where you're trying to get legislation passed, or in the case of archaic laws, expunged. There's the litigation arm of it. And in some instances, ACLU is providing the lawyer to a plaintiff or defendant.
Correct.
Whose case is important in its own right, but also which raises issues that are more broad. How you can't represent everybody.
Correct.
There are a lot of people whose rights are wrongly infringed.
Correct.
How does the organization make the determination we've got an ungodly number of cases, this is the one we're going to push?
Yeah. Well, carefully is the answer. We do impact litigation. So there are some organizations that will provide legal services to anybody who shows up in a housing situation, let's say, if you have a housing problem. There are people who handle that. We select the cases because we think we can highlight an injustice that we think has a legal redress of some kind. We, for example, took on a case of a young woman who, with her American husband, was at the Immigration and Naturalization Service to prove that they were married. It was a real marriage, it wasn't a fake. The people came out and said, good news, we agree that you are married, and the bad news is ICE is here to take you off into detention. And we took the case and got a class certified. So it's not just that person, but we got everybody who's similarly situated is now being represented, and hopefully their rights are being vindicated on a class-wide basis in front of a federal judge.
So what rights, if any, in the Constitution and in state constitutions, does somebody who is an undocumented immigrant have?
It's mostly the due process clause. You know, there are a whole slew of rules around immigration that I don't know very well. But what's very clear is if you want to, there are certain processes and procedures that the Congress has said are the way that you treat people. And when the government tries to do an end run around them, our job is to say, no, wait a minute, there's actually a process here, and you need to follow your process. For example, many of these people showing up on the border in the South, people keep calling them illegal immigrants. They are presenting themselves legally seeking asylum because their lives are in danger. This is why Jewish people came from Europe after the Second World War, and they are following a legal process. And the reason we are suing is because the Trump administration is trying to ignore all the rules that Congress set out as to how we would accept people who are fleeing death threats. And, you know, we have to hold these people accountable.
So the focus in the news is primarily what's happening on the border
Mm-hmm.
and kids in cages in the extreme case. There are also, quote unquote, undocumented immigrants who've come here on visas
Mm-hmm.
and may or may not have overstayed the
Right.
limits on that.
Or brought here by their parents, right? In the case of Dreamers,
Yeah.
who were here, who are technically illegally. But illegal status is a very broad category, and there are multiple statuses under that, some of which entitle you to at least a hearing,
Right.
or not being locked up until you're shipped, that you're allowed to out of prison, and that you can support your family and children while the process is working out. And it's kind of like asking to make sure that a warrant gets issued.
Mm-hmm.
You can have the information. Maybe you can even kick someone out of the country, but you have to do it according to our rule of law. This is
Due
about the United
process.
States. Yes.
How it's done as opposed to just grabbing
Yes.
people off the streets.
Yeah.
And obviously there's an emotional reaction
Mm-hmm.
to deporting some kid who's only known this country, to send him or her back to another country where they've got no connections and don't speak the language.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think we could have a hearing.
You'd think we could.
Yeah. What are the prospects on that in terms of where the law stands now?
Well, the ACLU, before Trump was elected, immigration for Massachusetts, for example, wasn't a high priority for us. We didn't think it was a really big problem. At the moment, huge resources are being devoted. We were among the people showing up at Logan Airport when the first Muslim ban was put into place, because we said you can't exclude someone because of their religion. That's not who we are. Congress shall make no law,
Right.
With respect to establishment of religion. There are huge resources, and I mean, I don't know all the details, but some of the stories, even when there are people back in the home country, in Guatemala, one of the stories that I heard was of a young person. They finally identified the parent who had been deported back to Guatemala. They approached the father and said, "What do you want to do?" And the father said, this is the most painful decision I could ever make. I want him to stay in the United States and have a chance for asylum, because if he comes here, he will be killed, which is the reason they tried to come here in the first place.
Yep. Takes one's breath away. We have less than a minute to go. What can somebody who's a resident of Gloucester, Cape Ann, whatever, might be seeing this, if they call up the ACLU, can they get a copy of the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, but getting a copy of the Constitution isn't the same thing as living it, right? And I think my advice to people is stay tuned, because things happen in the dark sometimes, and stay engaged and vote.
Yes.
You are the ones we all have the ability to change our government and to make a lot of this litigation unnecessary.
Well, thank you so much, JB, not only for visiting with us today, but all you've done over the years for Civil Liberties and for the rest of us. So
My
thank you so
absolute
much.
pleasure. Very good.